The sea drew its breath against Dragonstone in long, heaving sighs, as if the island itself were an old creature that remembered names older than men. Before dawn the basalt seemed almost blue. The waves rolled in with the slow insistence of a promise made and remade across centuries. The carved dragons along the causeway were black in the half-light, their eyes full of rain and salt. The wind smelt of wet ash and kelp and the faintest bite of cold iron. Jon walked the ramparts with Davos, boots loud on slick stone. The air pressed against his scars, clean and raw. Down below, gulls skated on wind like glimmers of torn parchment, and the black beach gleamed as if oiled. "They'll not like it in the north," Davos said, the way a man mentions a coming storm because it's already on the horizon. "Your sister, your bannermen, even them that truly love you will wonder what you promised and what was taken." "I promised them life," Jon said quietly. "I don't have more to give." A line of white appeared on the water where a current crossed another, then broke apart. He thought of the wall's cold shadow and of words spoken in the dark that were not oaths so much as shields men held up to ward off night. He had broken one set of vows to take up another. It had not been for love then. It had been for duty, which was a kind of love that left no room for warmth. And now necessity had found him again, but it had changed its face. Davos watched him without pushing. "A king's marriage is never just his. You know that." Jon nodded. "I know." He turned a gloved hand toward the empty sea. "She asked me if I wanted a splendor of bells, a parade of banners, as if there's still time for splendor." "There's always time for a bit of bread and salt," Davos answered, half a smile in his beard. "But it's true enough. The world is like a winter hearth. It will take a spark, or it will die cold. We're past the hour for listening to the log crackle and saying how fine the fire might be." Jon's mouth twitched. "I hope she hears that when you say it. She respects plain speech. She's smart enough to do so." Davos nodded toward the inner wall, where a torch slew back and forth in the wind as a figure moved past. "More clever than most kings I've known, and kinder than she needs to be. And you, my lad, you look like a man about to set his hand to something that will not be undone. If we had a weirwood, I'd tell you to put your palm to it and ask the old gods to weigh your heart." "There's no heart tree here," Jon said. "There's the sea, and there's the truth. If it helps, I've seen vows sworn on worse." Jon grunted, but he slowed, looking west where the sky unpinned a seam and pale silver bled through. The wind stung his eyes. Somewhere out there were snows his bones understood. Somewhere far north, beyond even that, was a night lifting its head. What vows were steel against that? Perhaps none. Perhaps only the ones people kept because they had to look those they loved in the eyes every morning. A bell tolled in the depths of the castle. One note, steady. Jon and Davos paused, as if the sound were a hand that pressed them firm into the hour. It was not a grand thing. It was not meant to be. Inside, Dragonstone's corridors were warm and damp with breath. Torches pushed back shadows without annihilating them, which felt appropriate. Tyrion's voice could be heard in the council chamber, soft and needling. Lists of houses, guesses at ravens, balances of men and grain and time. Missandei moved through the rooms with an ease that made walls seem hospitable. Grey Worm's eyes were the color of iron, but when he looked at his queen, they softened in ways words had difficulty describing. Daenerys stood near an open window and the wind toyed with the ends of her hair, lifting silver strands like threads pulled for some precise mending. She wore no crown. There was a blue cloak about her shoulders that Missandei had clasped with a simple pin. Its color echoed the sea at noon and the cloth looked warmer than it was. She held her hands together as a girl might hold the first bird to land there. Not too tight, not too loose. "I thought of my first wedding," she said when Jon entered. "That the gods were watching, though I did not know which gods. It was a feast of noise and smoke, and no one looked at me unless it was to appraise who my husband had won. I thought if this day came again, I would want it to be smaller than a whisper." "Some whispers can be heard across mountains," Jon said, "and some are for a single heart." Her smile then contained more strength than many armies. Do you want simple words or ancient ones? We have both, though no priests to pretend the gods must be cajoled. I could speak in the old tongue if it pleases you. Plain words, Jon said, and a promise I can keep. She nodded as if she had expected that, as if she had come to know the shape of his choices the way she knew the coastline of an island from maps she had stared at too long. Then let it be plain. Missandei placed a low bowl on the table. No delicate gilding, only black volcanic stone filled with water and a sliver of driftwood bleached to the color of bone. Sea and tree, she said softly, in a ceremonial cadence. For old gods and new, salt and smoke for what is left behind. Witnesses enough. And she glanced toward Tyrion, Davos, Grey Worm, Yora, all drawn into a circle that was both spare and irrevocable. Speak, my queen. Daenerys drew a breath. I promise to stand between the night and those who trust me to hold a torch. I promise to counsel with open hands and not closed fists. I promise you my strength and my mercy, and my name to shelter you or bind me to your fate, if such a binding can be called shelter. Jon swallowed, not because the words were ornate, but because they were simple enough to weigh more than gold. He saw the ghost of a heart tree in his mind, saw thin red sap and a white face carved with an unblinking sorrow, and he thought of his father's eyes that were not his father's. His voice came without flourish. I promise you my truth, even when it hurts me. I promise you my sword, even when fear tells me to keep it. I promise to share what I'm given and to ask nothing you cannot gladly give. I promise that if I must turn toward the dark, I will do it with your hand in mine. The room seemed suddenly smaller. The sea pushed and withdrew like a breath one breathes for the wounded. Missandei dipped the driftwood and touched the water to their joined hands. Davos watched as if he could see the old gods nodding in the texture of the wood grain. Tyrion's eyes shone in the way of a man too used to the humor of living who finds that, unexpectedly, life has permitted him to be serious. Salt, Missandei said, and the drop of seawater was cold where it ran down Jon's knuckles to Daenerys' wrist. Smoke, she added, touching candle flame to the very edge of the driftwood. The scorch mark bloomed like a faint memory. The words are spoken. The pact is known. Jon and Daenerys looked at each other. For a heartbeat, they were not king or queen or savior or weapon. They were two people who had found a thing like still water in the space between breaths. When they kissed, there was no roar from without, no drums, no Dothraki ululation, no crash of cymbals. Only the lantern's small hiss, and the sea that kept doing as it had always done, indifferent as a god and as faithful. Yora cleared his throat to cover his own uninvited feeling. Grey Worm stood straighter. Davos, who had long ago loved a plain woman and lost her to a fever that had not even bothered to name itself, bowed his head and thought of hands intertwined by the smallest sanctities. Tyrion broke the silence with relief because silence had begun to feel too fragile to hold. Now for the RA. He caught himself, remembered Jon's frown at the manipulation of optics, and revised with effort. For the letters that should follow any change of state, we must tell the world what has happened, and tell it in a way that neither insults it nor invites it to misunderstand. We will inform the North, Daenerys said. Jon. She did not take her hand from his. It has to come from me, Jon replied. Sansa will sort what she must, but it should be my words. I will send ravens to the Reach and to Dorne, Tyrion said, already half-seated with quill and parchment, wine breathing beside him, and to the Iron Bank. They will not care for vows, but they care very much for probabilities. Our union changes sums. Send one to Jaime, Daenerys said. The room turned its head at that name as if a sparrow had flown in from an unexpected season. Yora's mouth flattened. Grey Worm's jaw tightened. Davos lifted a brow but said nothing. Cersei will not surrender because of a letter, Tyrion said after a beat. Cersei will not, Daenerys said. But Jaime might be reached by the knowledge that the North stands with us and that we come not to burn a city to coals but to end a war. I will not have the blood of children in the mortar of my claim. Tyrion's eyes softened. I can write to him. He will listen to me if only to choose not to heed. And perhaps the ink stains will remind him we shared a mother once. There will be no terms for her, Daenerys said, sure as surf. But for her men. For soldiers who lay down arms, amnesty, Jon said. For those who fight, mercy if they yield at once. And food for the city. If we can spare enough to show our purpose is not to starve them for obedience. Food, Tyrion murmured, scribbling. Bread sometimes pacifies better than proclamations, it's true. And scorpions do not eat. The scorpions, Yora said, must be accounted for. We will not sit beyond the range of their bolts and wait for winter's convenience to take us, Daenerys answered. But neither will we be lured to the narrow streets where fire becomes a byword for grief. We will show them strength enough that the bells ring by choice. The bells, Jon repeated, imagining their sound not as triumph but as a release. Missandei, whose expression rarely revealed more than patience, allowed herself a small, fierce light. If they ring, it should be because people inside the walls want to live. Then we must give them cause to believe we want the same, Daenerys said. The letters went out like white fish along a black current. Within a day, the ravens were lines on air, purposeful and tireless, their messages wrapped tight in their speed. One flew north to Winterfell. The hall there had a different echo than Dragonstone. It smelt of wood smoke and wool oil, of dogs and wet cloaks and the faint iron of steel scraped on stones in the yard. Outside, snow had fallen in a stingy confidence, as if saving its worst for later. The weirwood in the gods would held its red leaves stubbornly though frost had glazed the edges. Sansa unfolded the letter with careful hands while the fire made a low, constant music. Brienne stood a pace behind her. Arya lounged on the bench opposite with her boots planted and her eyes bright as if the letter were a blade she might learn the balance of by watching someone else wield it. Sansa read it twice. The first time her face was the smooth face she had taught it to be in King's Landing, all courtesy. The second time her mouth tightened very slightly, the way a seam pulls when a garment no longer fits. He married her? Arya said, as if that were a step he had taken onto a narrow bridge over a chasm. Just like that. Not just like that, Sansa answered. Jon does not leap. He steps where he believes it is right to step. And he tells me he believes this is the way to save the North. She held the letter closer to the fire, not to burn it but to see the weight of the ink. He asks me to keep the peace here, to keep the lords at their hearths and their tempers in their chests. You won't like being told? Arya said, a shade of mischief and sympathy both. No, Sansa folded the parchment once, twice, until it sat like a hard, thin thing in her palm. But I know how to do what he asks. Brienne inclined her head, her hand at her sword because it allowed her not to flail. The lords will be uneasy. They will be furious, Sansa said bluntly, and for a moment she looked as tired as a woman 30 years older. Not because he has wed, but because of what it means they think it means. They will say the North is a prize in a southern game. I can make a list of those who would say it loudest, Arya announced, with a glint that made Sansa shake her head. No, Sansa said, not gently. We will not answer fear with fear. She breathed out. I will summon them. I will tell them that our enemy is winter and death, that our brother does not trade us away, not even for dragons. And I will secure the grain we have and buy more from White Harbor if there's any to buy. Tell Maester Wolkan to send to the Manderleys for their stocks of salt fish and to the Umbers for root cellars that can spare a barrel. We will not starve while the world decides who it wants to kneel to. Arya's grin flashed. There's my sister. Sansa almost smiled back. And where will you be while I talk until my throat bleeds? In the shadows, Arya said easily. Where men who mutter too loud forget to mind their steps. Sansa's eyes met Brienne's. Sansa did not need to say protect her. Brienne did not need to answer I will die first. In King's Landing the letter came to Jaime by a familiar hand he had not seen in years, and a script that made him want wine as if wine could make blood less blood. He broke the seal with his thumb and read, standing by a narrow window that took too much sun for the room's comfort. Dust rose in the beam as if it were a sort of incense for the poor. He sat without meaning to and read again, and when he finished he rubbed his thumb over the seal as if it might yield something else. A scrape at the door, and then Qyburn glided in as only a man accustomed to being unwelcome could glide. Quiet, insinuating, always prepared to be the thing you did not want to see. "My lord Hand," Qyburn said. Jaime did not correct him. He had no wish to deliver irony to himself. "She married him," he said, and he was not sure whether the weight on the pronoun was derision or relief. Perhaps neither. Perhaps only inevitability. "So it seems," Qyburn murmured, and his eyes were not looking at the letter so much as at the air around it, measuring currents no one else could feel. "A useful union. It simplifies certain calculations." "For her?" Jaime asked. "Or for you? For the city, perhaps?" Qyburn went to the window and peered out as if there might be scorpions crawling along the rooftops of Flea Bottom. A combined army of northern and foreign forces appears weighty even on parchment. Imagine what it will be when men see two dragons turning above the Blackwater like storm birds. Jaime thought of fire on the Trident. No, not fire. He could not help what his mind did with that scene. He pushed the thought aside. He had seen a dragon already, its shadow uprooting courage the way a storm tears the first leaves off trees. He had felt the raw awe in men around him turn to something like despair, and he had watched courage become stubbornness because it had nowhere else to go. "Cersei will not yield," he said. It was as obvious as breath. "No," Qyburn agreed, "but others might. The appetite for dying is never as robust as men pretend in halls." Jaime closed his eyes briefly. He could see the city from here if he leaned out far enough. Roofs like fish scales, the red keeps cruel grace, the sept on its ruins that still unsettled him though he had not loved gods for a very long time. He saw instead a child, no, many children. Faces he did not know and never would. Faces that would become ash or else harden into something worse than ash. There had been too much of both already. "Leave me," he said, and Qyburn obeyed as he obeyed anyone who held power. Not because he respected them, but because he respected power. Jaime wrote to Tyrion that night. The letter's words scratched as if they wanted to be claws. He wrote that he would speak with the Queen. He wrote that he would save those he could, even if it meant losing himself to the judgment of a woman who did not forgive. He wrote without asking for forgiveness himself. He had given and taken enough of that currency already. Cersei read Daenerys' message and Jaime's reply in a light that gilded her hair and did nothing to soften her eyes. She sat very straight and very quiet, and that silence made Jaime's stomach harder than any shouted rage could have done. "So," she said at last, her voice like a blade drawn slow. She found herself a Ned Stark with better cheekbones. She found herself an ally, Jaime said. She found herself a leash that smiles. Cersei dropped the letter on the table as if it were an insect that had displeased her. "This changes nothing. It changes numbers," Jaime said. "It changes whether men believe they can survive another battle. It changes the way bells sound. If they ring, it will not be for you." He heard himself and hated himself for saying it where she could strike him with it. Cersei smiled without warmth. "They will ring for whoever stands inside these walls when the dust settles. You would fill the walls with wildfire," he said, and he did not mean to speak the last word, but it came anyway, as if it had been waiting in his mouth. Her eyes sharpened. "Only if they force me to. Only if my child's life burns in the wick of their torches." Jaime stared at the curve of her belly, at a promise that had come late and wicked, and he saw in himself a younger man standing in a place that had smelled of smoke and sanctimony and swearing to a thing that had meant something and then meant something else entirely. He had killed a king for what that man would have done to a city. He might have to leave a queen to prevent what this woman would do to it. "They want to parley," he said. "They want to preen. Let them. We will smile and show them all the teeth of our city, and then we will bite. Or perhaps we will do nothing and watch them starve. Winter makes men patient. Winter makes men desperate," Jaime said. "Patience is a luxury for those who have full bellies, and we are not the reach." Her eyes flickered like a coin spun on a table. "We will see." When the raven came from the Iron Bank, it was cool, courteous. and full of meanings that would have been impolite to spell out. From Braavos' perspective, dragon and wolf together were a model of risk consolidation. The bankers preferred safe returns to passionate losses. They would arrange their terms accordingly. Tyrion sat with the letter and smiled grimly. "They'll stand near whichever ladder looks steady. Then we'll make ours look steady," Daenerys said. On the third day after the marriage, a fleet sailed from Dragonstone, craftless of banners but very rich in intent. The skiffs were fast and low, the galleys cautious, the sails reefed against a wind that wanted to lift them like gossip. Drogon and Rhaegal shadowed them in the clouds the way thoughts shadow the good intentions of men. Jon rowed in the leading boat with Grey Worm and Yora's steady quiet behind him. Daenerys stood with her hand on the gunwale, hair braided back in a way that would not whip into her eyes, cloak fastened high. Tyrion sat and attempted not to be sick, not because he was unseasoned, but because seasickness is a poor listener. The Blackwater glittered like a sheet of mint hammered too thin. The city rose before them with all its contradictions and cruelty. Beauty armoring squalor, sunlight glorifying filth. They could see, even from the water, the new scorpions mounted on the walls, ornate, menacing things that would look almost comical if they had not already proved their teeth. The ships anchored beyond effective bolt range, and parley was requested by flags and by a messenger boat with a white scarf knotted at its prow. Came back with a time like an order. They met on a spit of land opposite the city, where once kings had branded bastards and now hopefuls branded their claims. The ground was flat and ugly, which made it easier to see the shape of power upon it. Jon and Daenerys stood surrounded by their guards and a spare dignity. Drogon's shadow came and went like a curtain of night drawn and redrawn over the stage. Cersei came with the mountain at her back and Qyburn at her side like a crow. Jaime rode with her and did not look at Tyrion until he did. Their eyes touched and fled apart. Euron was absent, which meant he had decided to take his coward's theater to sea again. "I see you have found a northerner with a talent for kneeling," Cersei said pleasantly. "I see you are still an expert at insults that reveal your fear," Daenerys answered without softness. "We are not here to trade them. Are you not?" Cersei smiled, and even that was calculated. "The city's markets are very good for that sort of commerce." "You will surrender your armies," Jon said. His voice carried. He was not a man for speeches, but the words he had were clean and heavy. "Your men will lay down their arms and go home. Those who do so will be pardoned. The city will open its gates and we will send food in. There will be no sack. There will be no burning. You are not our enemy, your hunger is. Your winter is. And if we decline this generous invitation to humility?" Cersei asked. "Then we show you why we mean what we say," Daenerys said simply. "By all means," Cersei said lightly. "Show me." Daenerys glanced at Jon and he inclined his head, a movement so small it might have been a trick of light. She turned and lifted one hand. Above, a line cut the sky. Drogon came down not in a horrible rush but in a controlled descent that made control itself the spectacle. He landed with a sound like the end of a winter in a place that had nearly forgotten thaw existed. Dust fountained. Men flinched. Dragons are like gods. Even when they do nothing but breathe, they dominate. Daenerys stepped forward. Drogon bent his great head until his eye looked at her on her level. She laid a hand upon the rough, hot leather of his cheek. Then, very deliberately, she walked with him to the very edge of the river where barges loaded with grain bobbed in the swell. She put a torch to their kindling and then held it away. Drogon's throat swelled minutely. A thread of flame curled toward the wood, touched it, did not consume it. The barges speared into fire and then settled to smolder. It was a controlled burn. Enough to show there was fire, not enough to starve a city. Tyrion spoke then, voice pitched to Carrie. "We can burn your scorpions out of the towers. We can fill your night with the sound dragons make when they enjoy themselves. Or we can feed your children and your old women and your men who have fought for you because you told them they must." Jon added, "We won't wait long. The dead will not." Cersei's eyes had not left Drogon. When she spoke, they were ancient. "The bells will ring when I tell them to," she said. Then we will see who the city believes will keep them alive, Daenerys said, and the words were not anger but bone. The parley ended with nothing tender gained. But that night a whisper ran through the city like a draft. Bread, they said. Bread from the Dragon Queen's camp for those who came with empty hands and harmless eyes. The first to go were the bold and the hungry and the mothers whose children cried with a rawness that made walls uninterested. The gates did not open for armies, but a small postern opened at dawn and figures slipped through 1 and 2 and 5 at a time, shivering under shawls, trembling like people who have learned that anything freely given may also be snatched back without warning. They returned with loaves still warm, and with thin soup, and with the knowledge that men in unsullied armor had looked at them as if they were people and not burdens. Jaime watched from the walls. He saw a girl with a colored ribbon in her hair bite into a crust and close her eyes. He saw her mother's hands shake. He saw a boy with bare feet and an expression that did not permit thankfulness, because it had been too long since his heart believed in its own right to feel such a thing. He put his hand on cold stone and thought of the way stone remembers different weathers without choosing. At dusk, he went to Cersei, and his voice was the voice he had when they were children, and he had found a baby bird fallen out of its nest, and she had told him better to kill it than to leave it to be eaten. "Let them surrender," he said. "Let them crawl," Cersei returned. "They will die less. They will die anyway," she said, and for a moment the exhaustion in her voice was a mirror to his own. If not by fire, then by winter or by plague or by the slow knife of their own small lives. It is not my job to keep small people from smaller deaths. It is our job to keep them from monstrous ones, Jaime said. He did not mention the wildfire by name again, but it lay between them, an old sin turned into a tool by minds without scruple. If the bells ring because you command them, they will ring once and then again for your funeral. If they ring because men believe the door is not a dragon's maw, then perhaps we live and they live, and your child has a world to be born into that is not made of ash. Cersei turned her face away not because she was convinced, but because he had made her imagine the one thing she refused to imagine, that her power might be less than the sum of people's fear. Outside, in the olive groves beyond the city's reach, campfires were neat as beads. The Dothraki laughed softly near their horses. The Unsullied ate in a precision that did not require orders. Northern men sat with their backs to trees and talked in low voices about the way grass smelled in the riverlands and whether a dragon's scales felt like armor or bark. Jon moved among them without ceremony. When men raised cups, he touched his to theirs. When they were silent, he let the silence be. He found Daenerys near the edge of camp where the ground sloped down toward the dark water, a black ribbon in a blacker cloth. She had removed her cloak and the night strewed chill along her bare arms, but she did not seem to feel it. Her hair was unbound and the wind made a banner of it. "Cold?" he asked. "Not yet," she said and smiled a little. "Perhaps that is foolish of me. Perhaps it's stubbornness," he said. "The North calls it courage so as not to discourage it in its children." She laughed softly. "Tyrion says I could manage to be born, crown myself and topple a city, and then ask if I've done it politely enough. Tyrion likes to believe he understands rudeness better than he does," Jon said, and she laughed again, warmer. "He is writing still," she said, nodding toward the small pool of lamplight where Tyrion's bent head was a shadow that moved from page to page. "I think he means to fill the city with pamphlets freed by the wind." "He wants to persuade Jaime," Jon said. "Do you?" Daenerys asked. Jon thought about it. "I want to give him a way to be the man he told himself he would be. I do not know if that is persuasion or mercy. The world forces men to turn into twisted versions of their oaths. If we can untwist them, perhaps the oaths were not wrong." She looked at him, then not as a queen looks at a subject, not as a woman looks at a man she has chosen, but as a person looks at the only other person awake in a house where everyone else sleeps and dreams inconvenient dreams. "Do you ever feel as if we are both in the wrong story? That we walked in through a door meant for someone else, and now the furniture is all the wrong size?" "All the time," Jon said. "But I think the gods, if they exist, have fewer doors than we need. We must make do." She took his hand. The night pressed close. Far off, a bell rang for a shift change on the walls. It sounded too cheerful, as if bells should know better than to speak so bright in a dark time. Daenerys leaned her head against his shoulder, and they both watched the moon make a broken path across the Blackwater like a promise no one had managed to teach itself to keep. At dawn, a white flag showed above the city, pale and careful, as if it did not want to alarm anyone. It was not the Red Keep. It was one of the western gates. Men in Lannister livery emerged, shields up, eyes narrowed against what they expected might come. They were led by a grizzled captain whose beard had food in it and pride that had never been very expensive. He knelt, and when he rose his hands were empty. "We lay down arms," he said, not loud, not soft. "Not all of us. Enough to keep our children from asking us why we died when we might have lived. We ask terms." "Take off your colors," Grey Worm said, as he had been instructed, his voice neither cruel nor kind. "Go home. Any man who lays hands on a child or a woman between here and his door will be hanged. Any man who keeps the sword at his hip will be turned back." Jon watched as they obeyed. The red and gold cloaks fell in a heap like leaves that had decided it was not worth fighting frost. The captain looked smaller without his emblem, more like a man and less like a proclamation of some other man's will. He looked up at Jon with eyes that had known a few winters. "We fought for coin in the end," he said, almost apologetic. "It will not buy our graves back." "Go home," Jon said. "Teach your sons to plant and your daughters to haggle. Tell them that this time we chose to live." By midday, the flow was steadier. Not a flood, not yet. The city still had its teeth, but the day had edges. In the Red Keep, Cersei prowled like a cat that has heard a dog outside and refuses to admit it is afraid. She lifted a goblet to her lips and set it down again untasted. Jaime took off his golden hand and laid it on the table. He looked at the metal as if it were the answer to a question he had asked the wrong way. "I am going," he said. She did not look at him. "To your brother. To the men who are deciding they are tired of dying for us." "You never did care for the people," she said. "Not when they adored you. Not when they hated me." "I cared," he said very softly, so that the truth would not think itself a shouting thing. "I care because I have killed enough men to know it is not a matter of numbers to the dead." "You will not come back," she said. And now she looked at him and her eyes were a fire that did not warm. "Go then, take your honor. It will not sit you in a chair or lay you in a bed when the world turns." He did not answer because there is no answer to that which does not degrade the mouth of the speaker. He picked up his hand and fixed it to his wrist. He did not kiss her. He did not bow. He left her in her light and he went down through corridors that had trapped so many ghosts they had stopped noticing new ones. Outside the gate, he found a small crowd of Lannister men milling like sheep that have remembered wolves exist. He rode to the olive groves under a white rag and a memory of being young. Tyrion walked to meet him with his limp and his halfway smile and the scars that made his face honest. "You came," Tyrion said. "I was always going to come," Jaime said, which was a lie and not a lie. They stood together watching men pass out of one life into another the way men pass out of one season into the next. Resentfully, gratefully, because there is no other reasonable thing to do. "You know she will try to spite us in some way that makes the world smaller," Tyrion said, as if an armory's worth of love and hate could be captured in a single sentence. "I know," Jaime said. "I know too that if we make the world larger, she will be smaller in it." They brought him before Daenerys and Jon. Jaime stood unarmed because he preferred not to complicate things. He bowed, not deeply. His hair had more gray than gold in it. The lines around his eyes were not entirely the work of laughter. "Your Grace," he said. "And, Your Grace, I am here to give what help I can to prevent the city from drowning itself in its own stubbornness." "And why would you do that?" Daenerys asked. It was not contempt. It was the kind of question asked by a woman who has learned the cost of taking help from men who expect interest. "Because I have killed a king to prevent the burning of a city," Jaime said simply, and the old shame did not color his voice so much as steady it. "I will do smaller things than that to prevent lesser burnings." "Smaller," Tyrion muttered. is a comfort to those of us who are always looking up at other men's sins as if they were mountains. He looked at Daenerys. He speaks true. Jon studied Jaime the way one studies a man one would prefer not to need but does. Will she yield? He asked. No, Jaime said. She will bargain until the fire sees itself reflected in her cup. He lifted a hand as if to show it was empty. But if the bells ring, she will not be able to keep the city from exhaling. We must make them ring, not with a dragon's roar, with a promise that comes from within the walls. Daenerys nodded, then helped Tyrion write the promise in a tongue the city trusts. So the promise went out, not on parchment this time, but as rumor does, carried by bakers with flour on their sleeves, by washerwomen who beat sheets and news against the same stones, by guards who had set down their spears and picked up their sons. It said, if the sept bells ring before sunset, the gates will open, bread will come. No one will be punished simply for breathing. It said, the north has married the dragon because winter wants to eat us all, and together we are hard for it to chew. It said, you have lived with fear for years. Live one day with hope and see if it feeds you better. All afternoon the bells were silent, held in by fingers that could not believe in their own courage. On the walls, scorpions waited with the patience of naive things. In the streets, mothers counted loaves and measured them against their children's names. In the Red Keep, Cersei paced, and sometimes she stopped and put her hand on her belly as if to reassure the child that all of this was merely spectacle. In the olive groves, Jon sat with Ghost, who had appeared out of the morning fog as if carved from it. Ghost leaned his great head into Jon's knee and breathed in a slow rhythm that was the only calm thing in him. Jon stroked the thick fur and thought of Winterfell and of a figure under the heart tree whose face he had never properly seen. When this is done, Daenerys said, settling near him on the grass, we go north. Yes, he said, and we tell your sister that the north is not a prize, she said, as if promising herself. Yes, he said. He wanted to say something about a truth he did not have the right to give her yet. He wanted to say that names were not always the holes they cut for you when you were born. He did not. A sound lifted then that made the hairs along Ghost's spine rise. It was not the cry of a scorpion bolt. It was not a cheer. It was a bell, a high bell, uncertain. Another, lower, joined it. A third caught the tune, and suddenly the air was full of the wild arithmetic of ringing. Men looked at one another in disbelief and then in something softer. Women began to cry without meaning to. Children covered their ears and laughed because loud things are funny if they are not frightening. And for a suspended moment, the world discovered it did not have to choose between terror and silence. The gates opened, not all at once and not wide, but they opened. The first out were the hungry, the second the curious, the third the cautious. The soldiers in red and gold, who had not already walked away, laid their spears on the ground, as if to remind themselves there had been a way to do that all along. Daenerys stood. Drogon lifted his head, and his eye was a coin ablaze. She did not mount him. She held out her hand and Jon took it, and together they walked down toward a city that had chosen not to choke itself. Jaime watched the gates and felt something uncoil in his ribcage he had thought strangled. He looked for Cersei on the walls and could not find her. Tyrion let out a breath so slow it became a prayer. Bread carts rolled under unsullied guard, not to parade, not to mock, but to distribute. The loaves were dark, heavy with rye and barley, smelling of life. A woman with a red scarf took two and pressed her mouth to the coarse crust. A boy touched the flank of Drogon and then yelped and danced back, laughing, waving his hand in delighted pain. A priest of some minor god tried to make a speech and then wisely decided that speeches were less necessary than water. In the Red Keep, Cersei's hand clenched on the balcony rail until her knuckles blanched. Beneath her the city admitted and exhaled. She could have ordered the scorpions to fire anyway. Qyburn, reading the tension like a palimpsest, waited. She did not give the order. Perhaps she could not make herself turn a gesture of relief into a prelude for massacre, while daylight still made it possible to pretend a world existed where such a thing would never be necessary. Night fell clean. In the olive groves fires sprang up, and laughter crept into the edges of speech. The northern men sang a song that had no words and a tune that meant snow falling on a field the plow would break in spring. The Dothraki told stories with their hands and shoulders and the flash of eyes. The Unsullied spoke little, but Grey Worm stood by Missandei for a long time without moving, and that was a syntax all its own. Jon and Daenerys walked through this, not as rulers taking inventory but as people astonished by grace. Men greeted them with nods that were not grovels. Women asked them simple questions as if they were not carved into legend. How long will the bread last? Will the dragons sleep near the water? Do you think winter will be as bad as old men say? Daenerys answered what she could. Jon answered with his presence when he did not have words. Later, when the camp quieted and the city's bells lay at rest, they went alone to a low knoll from which the black mass of the Red Keep rose like a sour tooth. The moon was a scrape. The wind had veered and brought with it a breath from inland, dry and full of dust. They sat close. The day seeped from them in a slow drain. "Tomorrow," Daenerys said, not asking. "Tomorrow," Jon agreed. "We go inside," she said. "We go inside," he echoed. "We will tell them that surrender is not the shame their lords teach them it is," she said. "We will show them," he said. "They do not listen as well as they watch." She turned her face toward him, and in the dark her eyes reflected a small, stubborn light that might have been moon or might have been something more private. "Thank you for the bread," she said. "You fed them," Jon replied. "You made me remember why." She smiled, and this time the smile was tired and dangerous and human. "If you had asked me years ago what would make Lannisters lay down their arms, I would have said fear. Today it was bread." "It won't be enough for everyone," Jon said. "There are men who cannot imagine living in a world they did not force to its knees. Then we will show them how to stand," she said. "And if we must, we will take their knees from them until they learn the balance again." He felt the old sense of dread climb his spine the way frost climbs a window, beautiful and merciless. He took her hand and held it tight. "After this," he said, "we go north." "After this," she agreed, "we go north and we find where the night keeps its throne and we overthrow that king." "And if the north chooses to be free when the war is done?" he asked, because the truth he had promised wouldn't let itself remain unsaid. "Then we will bow to it," she said. So quickly it was as if she had been waiting to set him free. "I did not marry you to claim your country. I married you to claim the living." He exhaled a breath he had not admitted he was keeping. Somewhere beyond sight a bell rang once. A stray note or a lover's summons or a guard's mistake. It trembled and faded and did not return. The dark moved over them like a tide. They did not speak again for a long time. At dawn, Jaime Lannister returned to the city under escort, not as a prisoner, not as a supplicant, but as a lever applied to a stuck door. He went to the Great September's broken steps, where scaffolds had been thrown up as if men could make penance out of beams and plaster. He stood and shouted with the voice of a man who had given his life to a woman who could not give anything back. "Hear me," he called, and his sound rolled oddly in the emptied space. "Lay down your arms. It is not betrayal to prefer your child to your pride." The crowd muttered and shifted. Someone threw a rotten pear. It splattered against his cuirass and slid down like a small indignity that had lost its appetite. Jaime held his ground. "You will not be punished for living," he said. "I have killed for a king to keep you from burning. I will stand here and say it again to any who call me Oathbreaker. I would do it again. Is living an oath you will not take?" And then, whether the gods felt mischievous or the city's belly told it what mouths should be filled, the bells started again. Not because a queen commanded them, but because men in the belfries took hold of ropes with chapped hands and pulled hard. The ropes squealed, the wheels turned, the clappers knocked bronze, and this time the bells did not sound like defiance. They sounded like doors. The Lannister surrender was not one moment. It was a series of small submissions that looked to each man like defeat until he realized, days later, it had been relief. Scorpions were disassembled and their bolts stacked like kindling to be burned for warmth. Officers went to the Dragon Queen's camp to sign names on lists that made them feel like children in school again. The mountain stood on the steps of the Red Keep and did not move, an immovable warning carved from human rumor. Somewhere beneath the keep, casks that would have turned the city to molten glass waited, deadly and unused. Qyburn walked among his instruments and touched them like a lover denied and thwarted. Cersei sat alone and listened to the bells. She told herself she was counting them. She told herself that when the counting reached a number she had decided on beforehand, she would do something decisive that would make the bells irrelevant. She reached numbers and passed them. No decision came. She did not call for wine. She did not call for Jaime. On the third day, Daenerys entered the city. She rode not on Drogon but on a white mare whose coat showed dirt easily and whose breath steamed in the morning air as honestly as any plow horse's. Jon rode beside her on a gray whose attitude suggested it had opinions about dragons. Grey Worm marched ahead, unsullied spears upright, the line straight as the edge of an oath. The Dothraki fanned out along the flanks and did not show off because they had learned to respect the way a frightened city watches its own shadow. People lined the streets, curious, hungry, suspicious, grateful. They did not cheer. They did not hiss. They watched. That was enough. At the foot of the Red Keep, Daenerys dismounted and handed the reins to Missandei. She took Jon's hand and went up the steps. She did not look left or right. She did not look up to where gargoyles had cracked or down to where blood once washed. She went forward. At the top, the doors opened. Jaime stood there with the look of a man who had been trying to outpace himself and had, for once, chosen to stop. He led them into a hall whose banners had been taken down because malignant pride is most persuasive when it pretends modesty. Cersei waited on a dais that had never loved anyone who sat on it. She wore green as if to conjure the reach she had killed. Her hair was shorter than it had been, and she did not pretend it gave her humility. She put a hand on her stomach again, as if to remind everyone of her claim to a future. "Your city lives," Daenerys said. "For now," Cersei replied. "It will continue to live, if you yield." Cersei's mouth twitched. "Yield? I am the queen. You are a mother," Jon said. "Choose which of those needs to breathe tomorrow." Cersei's eyes slid to Jaime, and her contempt for him gathered like a thunderhead. "You bring my enemies into my house and ask me to step aside for hunger and weather. I ask you to step aside for survival," he said. "It is a small word that contains everything." She seemed to consider, which for her was an act, and then she said in a tone so light it might have been a veil dropped over knives, "Well, let us discuss terms." Tyrion, who had been prepared for this since he had first learned to read his sister's face, stepped forward. "There will be a surrender of arms, as you see outside. There will be amnesty for soldiers who lay them down. There will be provisions for the poor and the infirm. There will be no revenge killings. Your trial will be..." "My trial?" Cersei's laugh was like glass being cut, the sound of a no that does not require words. "For what? For keeping a throne that half the country has decided is a hobby. For blowing up a sept," Tyrion said, not raising his voice. "For killing hundreds to frighten dozens. For being a queen who mistook fear for love." Cersei shrugged, which was a kind of admission even if it refused to be named. "And if I do not agree? Then we seize you," Grey Worm said. "And the people of the city see you taken to a cell instead of seeing their houses burned." She looked at him as if he were a spoon that had thought itself a dagger. Then she looked at Daenerys and did not blink. "What will you do with me, child of a mad king?" "Something your father never learned to do," Daenerys said. "Weigh justice against necessity, and place mercy on the scale." She took a step closer. "You will live. You will have a trial. If your child is born, the child will not be punished for what you have done. But you will not sit a throne. You will not issue edicts from a prison and call it a court." Cersei's face changed so subtly that only those who knew her blood would have seen it. "You think yourself merciful. I think myself bound," Daenerys said, "to be better than the stories made about my name." Jaime's breath left him as if his armor had been unbuckled. For a moment he saw a different city, a different day, a different king on a chair sharpened to a point. He touched his golden hand and was grateful for its cold. Cersei considered again, knowing that there were few moves left and all of them left her smaller than she could bear. "I agree," she said at last, and something in the room exhaled that had not known it was holding its breath. "I agree to your amnesty and your bread carts and your preening. Keep your dragons leashed. Keep your wolves in their forests. Try not to choke on your good intentions." Tyrion had 1,000 things he could have said to that, all of them clever and none of them useful. He said none. He watched his sister and thought of their mother, and for one foolish moment he imagined a world in which love had been a river and not a reservoir guarded by dogs. Later, when the formalities had been written and signed and stamped and witnessed by more eyes than were strictly necessary, Daenerys stood on the steps of the Red Keep and looked out over a city that had not been burned. Jon stood beside her and felt the strange lightness that comes when a blade you have been braced to take does not fall. The wind carried up a sound like bees. It took him a moment to understand it was the city breathing. He squeezed Daenerys's hand, and he did not need to speak. She looked north. "We go," she said. "Yes," Jon answered. He thought of Sansa's face reading his letter, of Arya's smile like a knife she liked to keep hidden and clean. He thought of Bran and a bed of roots and a raven that had stared at him with eyes like the abyss under ice. He thought of men in fur cloaks walking into white vastness, of a sound like a wall cracking. The bells were quiet now. The sea would keep breathing. The olive trees would drop their fruit and the city would eat them or not. The dragons would sleep with one eye open. Cersei would be led to a room where the bars were not visible, and she would test them with words until her tongue bled. Jaime would stand in a courtyard and look up at a sky that every day forgot yesterday's weather. Tyrion would drink and not be drunk. Missandei would sit with a map of the north and learn the names of rivers as if they were cousins she had not met yet. Grey Worm would check the racks of spears again, a man for whom order was tenderness. The Dothraki would mock snow before it arrived and respect it when it did. Ghost would dream of running, and Jon would dream of a boy in a crypt and a woman with hair like winter sunlight and a man who called himself his father. In the morning, the first ravens went north with new letters. News of surrender, requests for grain, promises that the army would not linger like a foreign shadow under southern sun. And a final line in Jon's own hand to Sansa, "We come. Ask the lords to store more wood. Let the blacksmiths turn to mail and shovels both. Tell them I have done what I must here so that we can do what we must there." The ravens rose and disappeared into a sky the color of sober metal. The wind shifted. Somewhere behind the great white of the future, a blue eye opened. The road north waited. They left the city as they had entered it, not as conquerors on a dais, but as travelers crossing a threshold. Bread was still being handed out behind them. Bells were quiet because not every moment requires a history of sound. The scorpions were gone, reduced to bolts that would heat tents in winter nights. In the olive groves, men folded their tents with the precision of people who had learned their own lives depended on order. On the hillside above the road, an olive tree bent under the weight of its fruit. A child climbed it and laughed. His mother shouted for him to come down. He did not. He reached higher. He plucked an olive and tasted it, made a face at the bitterness, and laughed again. Jon tightened his gloves and stepped into the shade of the city's walls. Daenerys matched his stride. The shadow fell over them both, cool as a hand on a fevered brow, and then they moved through it into the full light. They left the city under a thin sun that made no promises. The road lifted toward the hills like a ribbon with rough edges. The olive groves diminished behind them. The smell of dust and olives gave way to loam and the faint iron damp of rivers. Men marched as if measuring something in their own bones. Horses worked at the bits and tried to decide whether dragons were wind or storm. The dragons shadowed them until the city was a dull brown tooth on the horizon. Then they lifted, circled once, and went ahead where the air was cleaner. The line of the host stretched and tightened and loosened again as any living thing does. Grey Worm moved through it like a seam. Missandei walked it with a book and a slate and a mind that counted not only grain but temper. The Dothraki learned the words for mud and hedgerow and toll, and decided which ones were worth spitting. On the second day, they crossed a causeway over marshland where reeds sowed thin songs into the wind. The marsh smelled like secrets. Davos swore he saw a heron as tall as a boy, and a boy as thin as a heron watching from behind a willow with a frog spear balanced in his hand. He touched his glove to his brow, and the boy nodded once, and then both were gone, the way old stories ghost in and out of the present. At night, they pitched orderly camps in fields where winter wheat was trying to make up its mind. Fires sprang and settled in cautious circles. Regal came down once and lay like a hill against which men could warm their backs. His breath steamed in long plumes that made frost glitter along the grass. Drogon preferred higher ground, his silhouette knife-edged against stars. One eye open like a lighthouse that had been built by a patient devil. Jon slept badly, as he always did on the cusp of travel and decision. Ghost sprawled where he could intercept any nightmare that thought to creep in. When sleep came, it was the shallow kind that catches on the first branch and does not let the dreamer dive. He dreamt of wood dark, wet, ringing to an axe, and of a woman's quiet murmur turned to steam when it met cold air. He dreamt of a wall that hummed like a struck harp and of a blue point at the very center of the humming, bright as a needle eye. At dawn, he walked the perimeter and found Daenerys standing with her hands cupped around her breath. Her hair was a mess of braids half unraveled by wind. Her cloak was lined in a fur. Missandei said was fox, and Jon said was kindness pretending to be fur. "You look like you slept," he said. "I didn't," she replied and smiled. "Sometimes a night of not sleeping is as useful as a night full of dreams. My thoughts found their way into corners they have not visited since I was a girl." "What corners?" "My brother's voice," she said. "He would have called the bells a weakness. He would have told me to burn the Red Keep and then furnish a new one with all the bright things the old had melted into. He would have told me that people who eat my bread will eat my hand if I leave it too close to their mouths. He would have told me that mercy is stupidity dressed in silk and that queens cannot afford stupidity." "And what do you tell yourself?" Jon asked. "That I have been stupid when I wanted to appear hard and hard when I wanted to be loved. That I am too old to be ruled by wanting. That mercy is not a robe we wear for a feast but a tool we keep sharp on the whetstone of necessity." "Davos says a tool is only as good as the hand that knows where to put it," Jon said. "Davos has hands that have known work," she said. "I trust men whose hands know work more than men whose tongues know speeches." "You married a poor speechmaker," Jon said. "I married a man who tells me when he thinks he is wrong," she answered, and her smile reached the corners of her eyes. "It is more use to me than 100 speeches." By midday, the road rose out of the marsh to a ridge where scrub pines leaned like old conspirators. The sky had scrubbed itself clean. From the crest, they could see north to where land bent into a darker line, a promise of trees and the first hard taste of winter. A cart had broken a wheel on the descent, and a knot of men gathered around it. Voices sharpened. A Dothraki horse nosed the fallen spokes, decided against eating wood, and looked offended. Tyrion arrived with Davos before temper could decide to embarrass itself. He studied the wheel, the slope, the flow of wagons waiting behind, and the expression on the face of the carter. A man with a head like a tuber and hands like knots in rope. "If we lift the axle on my signal," Tyrion said evenly, "and put the spare on, the road will continue to exist. If we do not, this ridge will become our winter. The choice is unglamorous, but it is real." He looked up at the Dothraki. "Would one of you be so kind as to show off the strength you brag about when drunk?" They brought the axle up like men raising a pole for a dance. The spare went on with a grunt and a curse, and the cart rolled down under a chorus of relief. Tyrion adjusted a glove and did not look to see if anyone applauded. "The history of kingship is the history of wheels," he said to Davos as they walked on. "If you keep them oiled, men call you dull. If you let them crack, men call you catastrophic. If you reinvent them, men call you a genius and then cheer when the first spoke fails. That's a long way of saying look after the little things," Davos said, amused. "A sailor's been saying that since the first fool tied a knot wrong and drowned for his trouble." They reached the inn at the crossroads in a knife-cold wind just past noon on the 4th day. His courtyard stank of cabbage and patience. A woman with arms like mallets and a mind as sharp as her knives ran it now. There had been 3 innkeepers since the last truly bad times, and she wore their lessons like another layer of clothes. She looked at Daenerys's cloak, at Jon's face, and did not bow. She told her girl to fetch stew and beer, and that was all the ceremony she thought necessary. Brienne of Tarth was waiting in the taproom with a cup she had not quite committed to drinking. When she rose, the room seemed smaller, but the effect was gentle, not threatening. It is surprising how much kindness large people can project when they have learned they must. "My lady sent me to greet you," she said to Jon, then to Daenerys, "and to ask your intentions plainly. Lady Sansa appreciates plainness." Daenerys inclined her head. "To come to Winterfell, to bring our armies to its walls and beyond, to understand what your brother saw when he stood on that wall and came back with winter in his hair." Brienne nodded. Her face did not change, but something released in her shoulders. Men who had marched under banners learned to read that kind of release better than they read faces. "I will ride ahead and tell her that you are as you write." "Will she welcome us?" Jon asked. "She will do what is needful," Brienne said, as if that were welcome in itself. Her eyes moved to Jaime, where he sat near the fire with his hands around nothing. "And she will judge fairly." Jaime's mouth twitched. "I prefer fighting to fairness. It's usually more honest." "You will accept fairness," Brienne said, not unkindly. "All of us will." She glanced at Arya's thin letter tucked near her belt and remembered a different inn, a different road, a girl in men's clothes who had looked at her as if measuring her armor for its honesty. She bowed to the queen, then to Jon, then left by the yard with her horse already saddled by a squire who respected efficiency. Tyrion found Sandor Clegane at the back table with a plate of food to which he was doing no kindness and a face that suggested he had eaten worse. The Hound looked up at Tyrion with contempt that had mellowed into something like rue over the years. "You look like a man who's been sleeping in a rich bed and wants me to admire his pillow," the Hound said. "I don't own a pillow," Tyrion replied and raised his cup. "I've been sleeping under a tent's edge listening to Dothraki argue with Northmen about which end of a fish is the head." "The eyes are on the head," the Hound observed. "Even horses know that." "Not all of them," Tyrion said, and watched as Sandor's gaze slid past him toward Arya's name engraved on the air. "She's still alive?" Sandor asked gruffly, as if disliking the question's tenderness. "Yes," Tyrion said, "livelier than any of us. He's in Winterfell cutting men to ribbons with the look of her." "Good," Sandor said. He tore bread with unnecessary ferocity. "I'll go north. There's something there needs doing." Tyrion didn't ask what, because he had grown wise in the economy of other people's vengeance. "Then drink this and try not to kick my queen's dragon if it sniffs you." "If it sniffs me, I'll cut its nose off," Sandor said, but he drank. They left the crossroads with an extra 100 mouths who had decided that traveling behind a living army was more useful than living behind a recent one. Missandei took their names and their trades and directed them to the supply carts with a firmness that made even stubborn men feel they had enlisted in something meaningful. A cooper was found for the casks. A woman who had lost 2 fingers on her right hand but knew how to mend harness took charge of the Dothraki leather tangle and made it behave. A boy with a voice like wind through reeds sang a song at dusk that made the men from the Vale stare down at their stew because it reminded them of home and they did not want to be seen caught by it. By the time they reached Moat Cailin, the air had changed its taste. It had clarity in it now that was not clean so much as demanding. The moat had always looked like a ruin that intended ruin for others. The stones here held damp the way skin holds scars. The crannogmen appeared like thoughts you have been avoiding and insisted on hospitality that meant bone broth and stern words. Howland Reed did not come out, or if he did, no name was put to the man who spoke softly to Jon and less softly to Daenerys about roads that float and enemies that sink. "The dead do not sink," he said, "but they do not know patience as we do. The neck will slow them as it slows all things. Use the time, use the time, use the time." He said it 3 times and then presented them with eels smoked over peat that tasted like a lesson. At White Harbor, Masts budded in the gray as if winter itself were sprouting supports. Wyman Manderley's nephew met them on the road with cheeks like chilled apples and a list of inventories that would have made lesser men swoon. 176 barrels of barley, he recited. 200 of oats, salt fish enough to stink 3 cities for 3 months. Woolens if your Dothraki don't mind itching. And 14 smiths with a fair hand at fitting heads to spears if someone gives them the heads. Dragonstone's glass is on the way, Davos said. If the seas behave like solemn men, the Manderleys can keep boats from misbehaving, the nephew said, and his grin was a constellation of family pride. The sea's a cousin who throws tantrums and then helps you put the table to rights. Tell your lord, Daenerys said, that his harbor smells like courage. The boy's grin enlarged. He says his harbor smells like money and fish, but he'll take your word. They rested one night in White Harbor's guest hall. The dragons slept on the breakwater with the waves slapping their flanks like impatient hands trying to wake giants. Children crept down to look at them and were gently shooed away by soldiers pretending to be stern and secretly falling in love with the idea that dragons might sleep like very large dogs anywhere they were not offended. Missandei walked the quay memorizing names the way some people collect shells. Grey Worm stood without moving for a long time and then surprised himself by asking a fishmonger how long it took to learn the smell of good fish. The fishmonger told him 7 years and a patient wife, and Grey Worm said very simply that he had the first requirement and would work on the second. Before dawn the horn at the gate sounded once, low and not alarmed. The column formed, the carts creaked, and the road north, which is less a road than a long argument with weather, received them. Winterfell's towers showed like a long-held breath turned visible. Smoke went up from the chimneys in unembarrassed columns. The heart tree's crown held onto the last stubborn leaves, as if refusing to dignify a season it did not respect. Jon felt something ease when he saw the crooked line of roof and wall he had known since he was small enough to think the world was made of stone and stew and stern love. They came in on a wind that had decided men needed reminding. The banners of the houses that had survived themselves lifted and snapped. The yard filled the way a basin fills. Quickly at first, then with careful swirls, then with the last few men elbowing their way into space now too small for them. Sansa stood at the top of the steps with a face that would have served equally well in a court or on a battlefield. The dress she wore admitted winter without letting it move in. Arya stood a half step behind her, not out of deference but because shadows are a resource and she had learned to spend them wisely. Bran waited in his chair, his hands quiet in his lap, his eyes too old and too young at once. For a moment there was a hush like fur. It held long enough for Jon to see everyone and for everyone to see Jon. His scar, his hair, the frost at his beard, the uncertainty he never bothered to conceal. Then the hush cracked, not into cheers, not into accusations, but into something useful. A shifting, a leaning, the collective adjustment of people making room. He went up the steps. Sansa's eyes caught his, and it stood between them. The letter, the marriage, the bread, the bells. He saw her inhale the dragon at his shoulder and hold it in and let it go. He knelt because it is good for men to kneel sometimes. She did not reach for his head. She put her hands to his face and kissed his brow as she had when they were small. "You look colder," she said, "and more alive. The south is too warm," he said, and the corner of her mouth flickered. Daenerys mounted the steps at his side, as if she had always known how many there would be. Sansa turned to her, their eyes measured without cruelty. Women whose lives had been forged on whetstones recognized the grain in one another. "Winterfell," Daenerys said, almost as if to herself. "It looks as if it meant what it said." "It usually does," Sansa answered. "You are welcome. We don't say it lightly." She lifted her voice. "You are all welcome. We won't say that lightly either. You'll eat what we have and work where we put you. You'll sleep under roofs that leak less than a storm. You'll do as you're told by the men and women who know our winters better than you do, and by the men and women who've marched with you through things we haven't seen. If you're quarrelsome, do it in whispers. If you're grateful, do it with your hands. There's wood to stack and snow to shovel when it comes." There was a grunt of rough assent. Men respect lists when they're trusted to carry the weight of them. Arya's eyes moved over Daenerys in a way that would have felt like a knife if it had been wielded by anyone else. From Arya, it felt like a lullaby sung through teeth. "You're smaller than I thought," she said in a voice too low to travel. "I have never been measured in inches," Daenerys returned, same pitch. Arya considered, and then her mouth tugged in appreciation before she could stop it. Bran looked at Daenerys as if remembering a story she had not heard yet, and at Jon as if hearing a story he had never told. "The road behind you burned," he said to Daenerys in a tone without accusation, only knowledge. "And then it didn't. It burned just enough to be seen," she said, struck by the precise oddness of the boy's calm. "And then it ate its own tongue." He nodded as if that answer belonged on a shelf in his head. "The river will freeze soon. The first thin ice is a liar. The second is trustworthy but mean." Sansa's eyes asked Bran a question to which she did not put words. He did not answer, but his lids dropped, and when they rose again there was a wind in them from a place with no trees. Inside the hall the smell of broth, leather, wet wool, and old oaths received them like a homecoming with a stern aunt at the door. Benches groaned. Bowls arrived. The long black table at the far end had been polished until the scars on it shone. Davos sat with the men from White Harbor and the Manderly nephew who proudly explained the arithmetic of salt. Tyrion found a place not too near the fire and watched the room the way a man watches the shore for a tide that does not move like other tides. Jaime came in under a dozen looks that said more than anyone needed to say aloud. He took those looks and set them down beside his plate the way a man puts down a weight he has carried long enough to lose the habit of taking it off. He stood straight and asked for an audience with the Lady of Winterfell. Brienne stood near him without standing with him. She would stand with him, but not before the North measured him with its winter and decided whether they would share it. Sansa made that audience the next morning at first light because knights do not make good judges. They met in a side chamber that looked out on the heart tree, its bark pale as a truth bravely spoken. Brienne took her place against the wall. Daenerys stood beside Sansa, because fairness is easier when witnesses are welcome. Jon stayed back, not because he wished to abscond from judgment, but because he had given the North its voice and it was not his to speak. Jaime bowed and did not overdo it. "I killed the man your father served," he said, and the honesty of that starting point put a small cut in the room's first hostility. "I pushed a child from a window and would have killed his future if the gods had permitted it. I gave my sword to a woman who let the city live because she chose not to remember that fire feels like power from the outside. I am here for the dead. If you demand payment, take my hand again. It is not much used except as a reminder. If you demand my life, take that too. There are others better thrown at the knight than I. If you demand my service, I will give it, and stand where the cold is darkest and the line thinnest." Brienne spoke then because it was her right and her burden. "He is not the man he was in King's Landing," she said very simply. "I do not say that to ask you to forget what he did. I say it to tell you that what he does now will not be governed by the pride that pushed a boy. He has paid for that with a lifetime of a name that was wrong and right at once." Sansa looked at the heart tree as if seeking counsel from the old face carved there, but her eyes were her own when she turned back. "I cannot give you absolution," she said to Jaime. "I am not a god. But I can decide what use you are to the living. You will fight. You will answer to Brienne. If you run, we will hunt you and kill you. If you do not run, and you live, you will see what your sword is good for when it is not being used to impress a father or a king." Jaime's throat bobbed. He bowed again, poorer and richer for it. Arya smiled to herself in a cold corridor later and ticked a name off a list that existed now only as habit. It had not died so much as retired. The next days were a rhythm of work that filled the halls until they hummed. The dragonglass began to arrive, black and bright as a dropped night. Gendry came in with the first carts of shaped blades, hair stuck to his forehead with sweat, grin rueful because he did not know how to look modest when proud. He looked at Arya, did not say anything, then said something anyway because people like him are helpless in the face of what they feel. "Look," he said, and set a spearhead on the table with a care that made it ritual. It sings when you hold it right. Arya picked it up, and it did. A high, faint note like ice giving way to the foot but not breaking. She spun it and felt the future lean toward her hand. "Make more," she said, and he laughed, grateful for the reprieve from anything too pretty. In the yard, the Unsullied drilled beside men from the north who had been taught to fight with anger and found themselves learning what it meant to fight with memory. The Dothraki discovered that the snow which came at noon did not feel like sand in the teeth, and they disliked that deeply, but they accepted it because they respected difficulty when it reared its head without apology. Grey Worm and Lyanna Mormont had a conversation about expectations in which neither gave an inch and each left with a professional regard so pure it almost counted as affection. The dragons circled Winterfell warily at first, dropping down to the fields when no sheep bolted and no child was swatted for running under their shadow. Rhaegal let Jon approach with the measured acquiescence of a creature who recognizes his own blood when it has lived most of its life under a different sky. Drogon watched Jon with an eye that said, "I could eat you," and Jon watched back with eyes that said, "I could let you." Daenerys stood between them not as a translator but as a friend who had introduced two comrades who would never learn to make jokes the same way and hoped they would respect each other enough to be glad to share a fire. In the Godswood, snow came as if embarrassed, flakes small and undecided, melting on the surface of the black pool and leaving no mark. Bran sat and stared at a point beyond the air. A raven settled on a branch above and shook itself like an old man. "They are at the last hearth," Bran said aloud, and the sound was not a boy's voice. "They are eating what they have killed." Sansa tightened her hands on the arms of her chair when he told her. She drafted letters that did not offer comfort because comfort was a currency too easily counterfeited. They asked for men and food and wood, and they offered the promise of a table where survivors would sit. She wrote to the Vale. Bronze Yohn Royce read the words and nodded once and made a decision that did not require Lord Robin to do more than nod object. Armored men began the long road under mountains that scowled. She wrote to the Riverlands. Edmure Tully, thinner and older and with a look about him like a man who had spent years getting out of a net and was uncertain what to do with his freedom, told his captains to make camp by water and learn to trust men who ride horses that do not like bridges. Tyrion took the shape of the North into himself with an appetite that had nothing to do with food. He walked the walls and learned which stones remembered being mended and which had never been scratched. He sat with the smiths and asked questions about slag. He spoke to washerwomen and found out how much lye there was left after the last batch burned the skin off 3 fingers and whether they had stopped using that recipe. He wrote to Old Town and asked for lamps and books and a man who would not insist on being called Archmaester when the snow was up to his knees. Missandei kept his papers corralled as if they were geese with ambitions. Davos built a table where 10 people could stand at once and not elbow each other, then showed Jon how to read a map by what it did not tell him. In a small room off the hall, Daenerys met with northern women who ran households that had learned to eat their own disappointments for breakfast. They told her how the snow drifts and the cow's udders bruise in frost, and she told them which flames were the hottest and how not to let men with banners ruin a kitchen. They taught her the names of their sons and where the ground stays warmer through winter. She taught them how to make a soup of barley and a fistful of dried fruit that tastes like something better than survival. When she left, they did not bow, but they lingered near the door to make sure she had taken an extra shawl. At night, when work fell off and the hall's sound became a low thunder, Jon and Daenerys took the ramparts and watched their breath turn real. They spoke less and less. The words were a luxury they hoarded now, knowing how often talk is a hedge against the knowledge that the world is not impressed by it. Sometimes he told her a story about a day at the wall when the smoke froze in the air. Sometimes she told him a story about a market in Meereen where a woman had sold honey cakes that tasted like sunlight on clean stone. Sometimes they simply stood, shoulder to shoulder, and listened to the roof timbers creak like old, contented animals. Once, as they stood, a man came out of the dark like a thought you had almost made but not quite. He was tall, moved awkwardly, and smelled of horses. His hair had gotten out of the habit of being combed. His eyes were pale as a scraped sky. "Jon," he said, and the name fell out of his mouth as if it had lived there all its life. Tormund, Jon said, and the smile he made then was not one he had practiced for court. You made it. We made it, Tormund answered, and his own smile was a landscape of tooth and winter. The rest are coming. We brought with us everything that can walk and some things that can't. The dead walk faster, but they're too stupid to look up when the ice is thin. We lost fewer than we might have, more than we like. Any giants? Jon asked, because hope dresses in other people's stories when it wants to go unnoticed. One, Tormund said. Dead. He spread his big hands. He'll be on their side now. He walked into the water as if going to the bath. When he came out, he'd left his name under the ice. They ate together, and the room leaned in around them as news leaned into men. The wildlings had found a pocket of dry wood in an old ruined hall and had kept it for 3 days as if the wood were a god. The wind on the shivering sea had been so clean it had made Tormund think of a woman he had never known. The dead did not tire, and they did not speak, and their silence was the language of water in the dark. The next morning the smithy steamed like bread. Gendry's arms were a map of new work. He had learned how to treat dragonglass, so it took a socket and held. The first tries had been a rain of glittering failure. He worked beside a winter-pale smith named Hylel, who had the mind of a mathematician and a heart like a kettle that always has water in it. Arya stood with her hair tightly back and her sleeves rolled and her mouth resting in a line. She had a long staff with a joint in the middle which she could take apart and put together with a click that made Gendry unreasonably happy every time he heard it. She twirled it and thought of a man with blue eyes and no breath. She thought of a courtyard in Bravos and a girl learning to lie with her body. She smiled to herself and planned which parts of the dead she would talk to first with her new spear's language. Jaime found himself in the yard more often than not, because the yard is where men feel useful when their minds are full of fog. He took instruction from Brienne as if it cost him nothing to appear schooled. That humility made the northern men grudgingly respect him. He did not flatter himself that they loved him. He slept badly, and sometimes he woke with his hand aching as if bones still lay under gold. He dreamed of a stair where a boy's hands had scrabbled for purchase, and of the way sunlight looks when you have made a choice that will mock every good thing you do for the rest of your life. In the morning he strapped on his sword and made a choice to be mocked less. Missandei wrote a letter at Sansa's request to the cities across the sea where Daenerys' name had once rung like a bell and then fallen quiet when she left. She wrote in a script that did not apologize for its intelligence. She asked for ships to bring food to White Harbor if the winds allowed and warned that the winds would not care. She wrote to the men of the Second Sons whose loyalty had been a line drawn in sand and might be drawn ag. In snow if there were a price worth the cold. She did not show the letter to Grey Worm because she did not need him to tell her that some doors are meant to be closed. She told him anyway, softly, that she would rather he stood with 1,000 farmers than 1,000 mercenaries, and the way his shoulders lowered told her he heard it as love. In a chamber near the kitchens, a man who had once been called the Hound sat with a potter who had lost 2 sons, one to fever and one to a lord's levy, and taught him how to wrap his hands when splitting logs so the skin would break in the right places instead of the wrong ones. "You've been fighting wood wrong your whole life," Sandor said, almost gentle and entirely impatient. "Wood wins when you try to be clever. Let it be stupid. Stupid breaks easy if you know where to look." A raven came with a thin black ribbon tied around its leg and a wax seal that smelled of roses under a layer of dust. It was from Old Town and Stavron, a maester who prided himself on being immune to spectacle and was endlessly seduced by facts. He wrote that the Citadel would send lamps and a surgeon who did not bleed men for amusement and a mortiser who knew how to make doors where there were none, and he added a postscript asking if a scale from one of the dragons might be obtained for study. Tyrion laughed and wrote back that he would try to convince a dragon to shed politely in the maester's direction. Failing that, he would provide a drawing and some lies. On the 7th day after their arrival, the wind went very still, the kind of stillness that means someone has walked into a room and closed the door behind them. Bran's eyes turned toward a place no one else could see. In the yard, men stopped moving without knowing why their bodies had decided to conserve themselves. The smithy flame guttered once and then burned straight up as if saluting. Ghost lifted his head and made a sound too low for the human ear, and yet everyone turned their heads towards the gate as if they had heard it. A horn sounded from the watch on the outer wall. It was not panicked. It was not bored. It was a note that said, "There is something you should come and look at." Jon and Daenerys were already moving. They took the steps 2 at a time. The wind smelled like iron and old breath. That is how snow smells before it decides to fall and after it has been holding back too long. On the road, a line came into view, thin at first, people walking, a cart wheel wobbling, a man carrying another man across his shoulders with the stubborn ferocity of love. Then the line thickened. They were not dead. They were the last survivors from the last hearth, Husker's Rest, small steadings with names like Blessing and Trouble. The dead had come through those places like the reasoning of a lie. These came with nothing but each other. Sansa's orders became action so quickly it felt like foreknowledge. She sent them to the old granary and the lower hall. She set the healers in a line with hot water and the soup Daenerys had taught them to make. She sent Arya to meet the wagons and pick out the ones with the eyes that had started to look like frost and find them blankets and strangers who would sit close. She had the children taken to the room with the blue walls and the chalk. They were given chalk. 2 of them drew dragons and one a fish and one a house with a roof so high it broke off at the top of the slate. A girl the age of ghost stories told out loud tried to touch Drogon's face, and then, when he breathed in and she felt it pull at her hair, she screamed and then laughed and then hiccuped and then coughed and then cried. Daenerys came down and knelt and put a hand on her shoulder until the crying was just breath again. "They painted the doors with blood," the girl told her, "because children tell queens the truth. Mama said not to look, but I looked. The cold was blue." "What is your name?" Daenerys asked. "Eda," she said. "You are very brave, Eda," Daenerys said. "Brave is not the same as not being scared. It's when you are scared and you do the thing anyway." Eda looked past Daenerys at Jon. "Are you scared?" "Yes," Jon said, without complication. "Good," Eda said, and let go of Daenerys's cloak and ran to the blue room where chalk had become a way to obey orders without being asked. Brienne and Jaime took a watch together on the east wall as dusk came early. The sky went that particular green-gray that looks like water deep enough to hide whales. Their breath smoked as they spoke in small sentences that built a structure of mutual endurance. "When it starts," Brienne said, "we will stand where the gate meets the wall. It would be a pity to have trained for 20 years only to die from a trip at the first stone." Jaime smiled with one corner of his mouth. "If we die tripping at the first stone, at least it will be fast." "I prefer not to die at all," Brienne said, which sounded like bravado and was not. It was simply an expectation Brienne had learned to foster because it tended to keep people from doing foolish things in her vicinity. "If you see me fall, you will step forward. If I see you fall, I will drag you back by the neck. Do you promise?" he asked lightly, and she looked at him as if the word promise were a tool men misused and she was protective of it. In a low stone room that had once stored beer, Tyrion dealt cards with Davos and a small clutch of men who liked to lose their money to someone honest. He did not look drunk and was not. He asked them, as he always did, about their sons and daughters and whether they thought the old gods preferred a particular kind of wood smoke. He learned that one man's wife had always wanted to see a dragon and had died before she could, and he filed that away in the place where he kept the things that should have been different and were not. When a runner came with a note from Missandei about candles and allocations, he excused himself with a joke so thin it snapped, and Davos put a hand on his shoulder because a man should have a hand on his shoulder when thin things snap. Cersei, meanwhile, sat in a room that had been built without a window and chosen for its lack of rope points and studied the seam between wall and floor. She had not spoken in 2 days. She put her hand on her stomach and counted in a rhythm that had nothing to do with bells. Qyburn had tried and failed to send a message. The raven had returned with wax missing and a second ribbon tied on mockingly. A guard with a soft cough stood outside her door and did not cough. It is astonishing how quiet a soft cough can be when a man is afraid. Jaime did not come to see her. She did not ask for him. She had stopped asking for things long ago and learned instead to take them. There was nothing in this room to take. She remembered drowning in sweet smoke while the sept fell up around her. She remembered Tommen's small hand and the way it had let go. She remembered her father's smell and the way she had learned that the love of tyrants has corners you cut your hands on and bleeding is called loyalty. She knew the prophecy by heart. She spoke none of it to the stone. She pressed her palm to the seam and, for the first time since she had learned to read men like ledgers, wished the world had been built to share. Qyburn was assigned to a house with a table and a bed and no instruments sharper than a spoon. He watched men walk past his shuttered window in two kinds of order and wondered how long it would take for order to eat itself. He had a vial in his sleeve and a second in his mind. He thought of opening the first for comfort. He did not. He wanted to see how the second might be manufactured in the dark without fire. The day before the storm settled its full weight, Sansa walked the battlements with Daenerys. Snow came in small wheedling chips that got in under eyelashes and made blinking feel like argument. Sansa kept her hood up because she was not foolish. Daenerys kept hers down because she liked to make bargains with discomfort. "You have few enemies left in King's Landing," Sansa said. "Something I had not expected to be able to say to anyone, least of all you." "I have one," Daenerys said. "She is quiet now. It will make noise later." Sansa glanced sideways. "If you intend to be merciful, keep being merciful. Mercy can harden into policy if you use it enough. Then your enemies are forced to argue with your policy instead of your heart." "You talk like Tyrion," Daenerys said. "He talks like me," Sansa answered. "Or perhaps we all learned from father and from men who were not our fathers." She rested her hands on the stone and felt its cold through gloves and cloth. "I will not lose the north because you married my brother." "I did not marry your brother to gain the north," Daenerys said. "I married him because the dead make better arguments than the living, and I am tired of contradicting them alone." Sansa's mouth accepted that answer without granting it complete authority. "We will have to teach each other," she said, which was not surrender and not a taunt. "If the north learns to bend, it breaks less. If you learn to let us stand, we will fall less." "I do not want you to fall," Daenerys said. "Good," Sansa said. And the snow found a new way into her hood and fell down the back of her neck, and she gritted her teeth and did not shiver because there are expectations. Bran spoke in the great hall that night, his voice carrying not because he pushed it but because every sound in the hall went quiet to make room. "They will test the ice at the weeping water and find it to their liking," he said. "They will lose 100 and not count it. They will break the frozen reeds and we will think wind did it." He looked at Jon and Jon felt that look as temperature. "They will not send their best first. They will send their wind." "What would you have us do?" Sansa asked, because questions are sometimes the only ways to be brave women in rooms full of men. "Burn the wind," Bran said. Grey worms set pickets like punctuation marks. He used men who did not panic and men who knew what to do when the first thing they had planned turned to vapor. He put Dothraki where the ground was deceptively flat and unsullied where the ground had tricked men into calling it familiar. He sent scouts in pairs, one to watch the other, one to come back if the other did not. He showed the men how to listen for the way silence changes when something large moves in it. He had chosen a banner with no animal on it, and he did not regret the choice. On the ramparts, beneath the narrow slits of crenels, Jon stood with Davos and Tormund and Jaime and the North's captains while the first true edge of the storm arrived like a guest who pretends he is early by accident. The snow fell without flurry, heavy flakes that made a sound like 1,000 tiny drum rolls failing to become thunder. Breath hung and did not disperse. Sound carried oddly. Men dropped wood and it sounded like plates breaking in a distant kitchen. "Torches," Jon said, and the runners went, their faces a litany of practiced fear. "We hold until we do not. We do not until we do. Tell them." It was not poetic. It did not need to be. Daenerys stood with Drogon and Rhaegal in a field of trampled stubble that would be white before long. She pressed her hands to Drogon's hot, rough hide and felt him shiver in anticipation the way horses shiver before a race. She looked up and the dragons looked up with her, and for a heartbeat the three of them were a shape the world had not planned for. "Not yet," she said to them, "because timing is a doctrine. Breathe when breath will be seen." Tyrion took his place where he would do the least damage and the most good. Behind the line, near the reserves, where men would come when they broke and where someone would need to speak to them without lying. He had a small cask near his feet and a cup on top of it and a warm cloak and a face that said he had seen this and he had seen it all and he had survived it and he would help them survive it too. He was not about to fight on a wall. He would fight here, with the tools he had acquired and hated. Words like tinder, jokes like flint, a memory like dry moss. The storm arrived completely just before moonrise. It did not roar, took the air and made it thick. Snow fell in such volume that men forgot their own names for a moment and then remembered them because someone shouted them. The wind turned like a creature that had changed its mind about whether it loved you. The first dead came with it, not a wave but an eddy, a cluster of shapes that moved wrong. Their eyes were the blue of a winter river under stars. They met the pickets and the pickets held, then bowed, then held again. Men screamed and learned that sound was a mistake because it gave the cold their breath. Men fought and learned that fighting is simply a way of staying where you are when something else wants to put you somewhere you do not intend to be. Fire lines lit in strips and squares, the snow settling on the edges and then sliding off in steam. Grey Worm held where the gate met the wall because Brienne had said she would, and promises matter. He moved his men in increments that looked small and were not. Lyanna Mormont shouted orders that were more accurate than any map. Davos saw a gap, cursed the man who invented gaps, and put a cart and 3 men and a pig in it. The pig died bravely and was mourned afterward with a cup of beer and a story about apples. Jon fought where he had to, which is to say he fought everywhere the line felt like a man with a cracked rib. He swung and stabbed and moved men a half step left and saved them and failed to save them. He killed in a way that had no flourish. He made death go home thirsty. He looked up once and saw Daenerys above the storm, and his heart grew 2 sizes and then returned to its proper shape when he saw her hold the dragons not in check but in readiness, an archer waiting on a breath. He looked down and saw Ghost disappear and then reappear as if the night were an old friend playing a cruel game. Arya found the places where the dead did not expect grace and put her spear into them. It sang in her hands and she let it. Gendry's blades held. When one broke, it did so in her favor, snapping off inside a ribcage like an argument that has discovered its last word. She moved with an economy that would have made Syrio Farrell proud if the dead could be made proud. She kept her eyes off the faces as much as possible, because sometimes the dead wear the masks of the living and cruelty is not knowing the difference. It is knowing it and letting it slow you. Brienne's shield arm burned as if the bone had turned to coal. She ignored her body as if it were a gossip. She struck and blocked and moved her feet in a pattern she had taught herself in a yard where men had laughed. Jaime took the blows she did not block and gave back the ones she could not afford to spend. The 2 of them made a machine that bought time with blood and interest. When Jaime slipped on ice, he did not fall because Brienne had told him he would not, and some men need to obey that kind of instruction as if it were deity. Tormund laughed until his beard froze solid, and then he stopped laughing because his breath had started to feel like glass in his lungs. He fought better then. Laughter is a luxury too. He saw a dead thing with a jaw that had once told bad jokes, and he killed it with a tenderness that would have made him a good father again if the world had given him the chance. The dragons came when the wind dared them to. Drogon and Rhaegal fell like verdicts. Fire moved in sheets and curls and ropes. It did not go where the wind wanted it to, it made the wind want to go elsewhere. The dead burned. The snow turned into brown water and black glass. The storm backed up a step and realized it did not like being told to move. Came again, harder. Drogon roared not with anger but with delight. There is a joy in using strength that makes even gods look down from their chairs. Daenerys' face was a mask that did not hide much. Focus, grief, precision. A terrible love. She healed her mount, and something in the storm learned the meaning of the word pivot from a being that was not human. Rhaegal's flame ran along the top of the ice line like a scribe's quick hand. Jon looked up and, for a heartbeat, the 2 of them made a shape together that the old gods might have called familiar. Boy and beast, man and legend, the old green made blue by night. He did not call for the dragon. He did not need to. Rhaegal knew where he was. Some connections do not have names and are not improved by them. On the 3rd hour, the dead tried the eastern ridge, where the snow drifted deeper and the wall was lower. Sansa had put men there who could be spared from glory. Men who plowed well and fought acceptably. They held for a moment and then bent. Sansa sent in the archers and then the women who had learned to fire at geese on the lake in autumn because geese are mean and flight requires humility. They shot better than the men that hour. Sansa sent a runner to tell the men and then thought better of it. Some truths do not benefit from being spelled out when pride is doing good work. The storm broke at the top like glass, finally taking the score cut by a careful hand. It did not disappear. It drained. The snow became a fine dust that drifted and obscured without convincing. The wind paused as if insulted. A sound rose in that pause that men would tell themselves later they had not heard. It was a sound like a scream drawn through ice. The first whites faltered and the second rank ran into them and then stopped, the way water sometimes does when a stone is placed with the right intention. "Now," Daenerys said to the dragons, and they bellowed as if someone had taught them the word. Blue light pulsed on the horizon for a heartbeat. Once, twice, as if someone had a cold heartbeat and the night was its chest. Bran, in the godswood, closed his eyes and did not move, but his breath counted the pulses. He saw a river frozen in veins and a line of bodies in water, seen from below, like a parade of truths about human weakness. He saw a face that was not a face. He saw a man younger than Jon in a room with a cradle and a sword and a woman bleeding, and he saw that nothing ends because men call it a name. He opened his eyes and watched a snowflake land on his hand and refuse melting. The dead fell back, first a step, then two, then as far as 15 paces, and the length of that distance was measured by 26 heartbeats of men who planned to die and then didn't. They did not break because the dead do not break. They were called. They went where they had been told to go. "Do not pursue," Jon shouted, because the first rule of living through a battle is not to let relief climb into your legs and make them run. He used the voice he had learned at the wall. It hated panic as much as it hated despair. "Hold, hold, hold." They held. The torch line hissed. The snow settled. The night paused and considered a different strategy. When dawn found them, it did not find victory. It found breath. It found a wall still up and a gate still closed and men and women still standing in patterns that meant they would go on standing. It found fire in the fields and dragons so tired they had turned clever and landed without asking permission. It found Daenerys with ash on her face and a smile that did not know how to be allowed. It found Jon with blood on his cloak and hands that shook as if they were remembering. It found Sansa with a list of the dead that she had not yet let become a list of grief. It found Arya cleaning her spear before eating, because there are habits that steady you better than food. It found Brienne with her arm bandaged and her jaw set in a shape that meant she would not humor anyone who asked if she was well. It found Jaime sitting on a stone and not shaking, and for that he was very grateful. It found Tormund telling a story to a boy who had not heard any of it and would remember all of it for the rest of his life. They slept in strips across the day like a patchwork thrown over a too large bed. Some slept on their feet. Some ate while they slept and later had no memory of doing either. The dragons slept with their heads tucked in and their wings half open like blankets. Ghost slept in a doorway where men would trip on him if they wanted to go somewhere foolish too fast. At dusk the wind shifted, and there was a smell like iron on old snow. Missandei stood by the well and closed her eyes because the sound the bucket made when it touched water told her more about the world than the talking of men. She opened them when a hand touched her elbow. Grey Worm stood there with an uncertainty he did not permit often. "You are cold," he said. "I am from a place that does not forgive cold," she said. "But I will forgive it if it reminds me to hold you closer." He did not smile much. He did not smile now, but his face changed in a way that made her feel that mercy had been placed on a scale. "I do not think of far-off places when I am here," he said. "I thought I might. I do not. I think about the space between your hand and mine and whether it is too much space." She linked his fingers. "Then there is no space." In the kitchen, men argued about whether onion should go into every stew as a matter of philosophy. Davos settled the argument by cutting an onion into a pot that had meant to stay blank and saying that cookery was like politics. You do what works and pretend you meant to all along. The women laughed and told him that if he spilled the salt he would have to sweep the floor, and he did because he had been a father and knew how to lose minor arguments in service of keeping major ones from starting. In the hall, Sansa went through the lists again and saw that the North had spent less blood than it feared and more than it could afford. She crossed names out as being alive and revised her list of whose children would need new boots. She counted candles and did not pray because prayer had become a way to tell herself what she would do anyway. Tyrion found Jon in the yard leaning on a post in a manner that tried to pretend his legs were not trembling. "You look like man whose body is trying to put itself in a drawer," Tyrion observed. "It can try," Jon said. "The drawer is too small." "Bodies love drawers," Tyrion said. "They love bedrolls and casks and blankets and tents. They love anything that says, 'We will be here if you want to lie down and die.' They are very persuasive. It's one of their good qualities if you plan to live long." Jon rubbed his forehead with the heel of his hand. "I don't like how much I know about dying." "It improves your taste," Tyrion said. "Men who think they can't die drink too quickly and spend too much time admiring themselves in polished metal." "Do you admire yourself in polished metal?" Jon asked, wary of the trap and springing it anyway. "I admire the metal," Tyrion said. "It's had a difficult life and learned to reflect ugly things without becoming ugly itself." Jon snorted. "You should sleep." "I will," Tyrion said. He did not. Bran was still in the Godswood when Daenerys came to sit beside him. She did not speak at first. She took off her gloves and set her hands against the wood of the bench and let the cold climb into her fingers as if she were learning a language. Bran spoke without turning his head. "You made the bells ring," he said, as if this were a personal memory of hers. He had fetched up and set on the table for them both to look at. "I showed them bread," she said. "The bells were in the bread," he replied. She thought about that, then nodded. "I did not come here to be wise. It keeps trying to happen to me. Wisdom happens to people who survive wanting other things," he said. "What do you want?" she asked, but his mouth tilted because that question is a trick when you ask it of a boy court and tree have made into a quiet. "I want you to be ready," he said. "There will be a door that must be opened when everyone else is trying to close it. There will be a moment when your dragon must not answer to fire." She thought of Drogon under her and his joy. "Must not." He nodded. "Fire will be invited to a place where breath is thin. Keep it outside." Then, because even ravens enjoy a flourish sometimes, he added, "And tell Tyrion that the lamp oil in the south corridor has been watered." She stood, half exasperated and half grateful. "You see much," she said. "I see enough to be tired," he answered. "But tired is not fatal." The second night came in a slow creep like a thief trying very hard to be a relative. Men whetted blades that did not need more whetting and then stopped because superstition is another word for routine, and routine keeps hands busy. Idle hands are the devil's work whether you worship that devil or not. The air had the taste of ice dust blown off far mountains. Somewhere a dog barked and made itself ashamed and lay down. The dead did not come in waves this time. They came in a new shape drawn by the wind. They filled the hollows. They rolled into the ditches and lay there while the living looked down and thought they had won a small victory, then stood up when the torches went past, and took legs and pulled until the line folded. Grey Worm had put men with hooks there, because he had expected treachery from gravity, and the hooks found the dead and yanked them back out of their own trick. Men behind pushed, men in front held, men in the middle did both. The hooks saved 12 lives and lost 3, and no one forgot either number. Drogon found the dead as they tried the east again and put a ribbon of fire across them as if tying a package. Regal swooped too low and 12 white hands reached up like love gone wrong and took hold of scales that had not been meant for human grip. He shook and men fell, and in his twist he sent wind and snow lashing into the torch line. 2 went out and 3 went out, and then Grey Worm's runner threw oil with a wrist that had been trained to line and not to arc, and it arced and the torches caught again, because sometimes an untrained motion is the right one. Jon found himself fighting next to a girl whose braid had frozen into a rod that knocked men unconscious when she swung her head. She laughed and killed and got a cut on her cheek that bled bright and then stopped, and she spat and wiped her mouth on her sleeve and disappeared. Men would tell stories about her later, and no one would believe them because they lacked the patience for the small strangenesses of war. At the foot of the wall, under a ledge where the snow had not quite settled, Tyrion stood with his cup and his lamp and his words. Men came to him with eyes that had forgotten how to decide. He told them good lies and good truths and sent them back where their bodies needed to be. Missandei sent boys with water between intervals and reminded him to drink, and he said he would and sometimes did. He looked up once and saw Cersei in his mind, her mouth a wound, and was hollowed by a private grief that felt indecently luxurious. He looked up again and saw Daenerys against the storm and did not feel luxurious at all. Toward dawn, when eyes hurt and muscles had ceased to be owned, a lull came that felt like an empty plate men were tempted to fling and call a feast. Jon stood with his hands on the parapet and forced his fingers to open. He looked down and saw a shape moving where nothing should be moving, a darkness darker than the absence of light, and for a moment he thought his mind had begun to forage in its own attic without permission. Then Arya was there, silent as a correction, her spear already pointed. He saw where she would go as if she had told him, and he shook his head once and pointed her elsewhere, and she looked annoyed and then not annoyed as she saw what he meant. The shadow was less than it pretended, the corner across was worse. She went there. A thing with a spine like a staircase came over the lip, and she put dragonglass into it 3 times and then stepped aside to let it fall in a dignity it had not earned. When the second dawn found them, it found them bruised and not erased. The dead had learned and retreated and would learn again and come again, and the living would have to keep teaching them the same lesson until either party ran out of pupils. Snow lay in the courtyard thick as a plan. Children threw it at one another with the solemn intensity of inventors. The kitchen boiled things that could only be described by color. Men put bowls to mouths and did not ask names. Jaime stood in a doorway and watched Brienne sleep sitting up, her chin on her chest, her hands relaxed for the first time in days. He wanted to put a blanket on her and did not, because sometimes dignity is warmer. He went and found a blanket anyway and put it beside her, and when she woke she took it without embarrassment, which is another way of being warm. Sansa leaned on the map table and drew a line where the last dead had come. She drew another where she thought the next would try, not because she could see with Bran's eyes, but because she had learned to read the weather of men, and dead are simply men relieved of the trouble of thinking. She spoke to the kitchen about when to bake, and to the smithy about when to rest, and to the watch about when to stop telling stories and listen for the sound the snow makes when it is too heavy and must slide. Daenerys went to the godswood, to the heart tree, and stood with her hands in her cloak. "We survived," she said to Bran. "For now," he said. "We will continue to survive," she said. "For a while," he said, and when she laughed it had almost the sound of bells. "Tell me something that is not a riddle," she said, not pettish. She did not have time to be pettish, but exasperated in a way that admitted companionship. "The door," he said. "When you see it you will know. It will be where fire would be comfortable and must not be allowed." "The crypts," she said, "because there are only so many places in Winterfell where fire would feel like entitlement." He did not nod. He did not need to. She turned and left with her face set in the way faces get set when women tell fire it must wait its turn. Jon found her in the yard afterward, speaking to Grey Worm and to Lyanna Mormont in a tone that meant to reconcile 2 forms of pride without causing either to decide it had been disrespected. He waited until they were finished and then walked with her along the wall where the stones hold cold in like memory. "There's a door," he said. "So Bran told me," she said. "Don't put Drogon through it," he said. "I won't," she said. "Not unless something worse than fire waits on the other side. If it does, I will ask it its name, and then I will burn it with a torch I will ask to borrow from you." She took his hand. "Tell me what frightens you most. Not for comfort, for planning." "Losing men who followed me because they believed I was right," he said. "Becoming a story that makes the wrong people bolder and the right people tired. And..." He hesitated and then finished because he had promised truth. "Telling you something that changes how you look at me." She stopped. The world kept moving. "Now is a poor time to tell me that I smell of smoke," she said, a joke to cushion whatever he had to say. He didn't laugh. She let the joke fall. "After," he said, "when we have more than a day at a time to give to the consequences of truth. Then don't borrow trouble," she said, and squeezed his hand in a way that meant she would wait as long as waiting did not endanger men. "We have rented trouble enough." In King's Landing, the sea hit the breakwater with a soft sound like applause in a room where no one is very impressed. The bread lines had shortened but not disappeared. People had begun to call the Dragon Queen's stew winter soup and not dragon soup because naming matters and dragons should not be expected to boil on every stove. The mountain stood where he was placed and did not rust. Cersei lay on a narrow bed and allowed herself to imagine the sound a baby makes in the hour before dawn. Jaime walked in a court where no one looked at him because there are kindnesses you grant to a man who has lost and is still walking toward loss. Qyburn found a sliver of glass under a floorboard and held it to the light and saw his own eye distorted into something wolfish. He smiled without humor and put the glass back where a rat's nest had once been. He had time. The dead loved time. The living hated it. He adjusted his expectations of both accordingly. The raven came from Winterfell with fewer words than letters. Davos had written it. "We held," it said, "thrice." It added the names of men and women King's Landing had never known and would never thank. It asked for nothing King's Landing could give. It closed with a line that was not clever and was not ashamed. "We will hold again." Tyrion read what he had made Davos write and felt, for a moment, the weight of everything he had learned how to articulate and everything he had learned to leave unsaid. He went outside to the yard and stood in the place where men came to breathe in air that did not feel like work. Snow began again, very soft, very intent. He held out his hand and caught one flake. It turned to water against his skin. He licked it and it tasted like stone. He laughed at himself and at the weather and went back to where Missandei waited with a new list of things that needed to be borrowed, found, made, and forgiven. Night gathered itself to its greatest height. The wind settled into the tune it plays when it is about to undo men's plans. In the long lists beyond the walls, the dead folded their patience the way a hunter folds a snare and set it down where the living would step. In the hall, candles made small, stubborn warmths in a room that could not be warmed as a whole. Men dozed, and in their mouths their breath made clouds like small promises kept by habit. Jon lay with his arm over his eyes and his mind refusing to sleep because it had tasks yet and a reluctance to put them on a shelf. He thought of Sansa at the table, of Arya in the yard, of Bran under a tree and above the ground and somewhere else entirely. He thought of Daenerys and the way her face had been when the bells had rung, softness and iron laid side by side. He thought of a man with a lute in a tavern near a frozen river who had sung a song about a wolf who married a star and how their children had been long-legged and always hungry. He slept then because the body will betray the mind sometimes for its own good. He dreamt of a door red as a flame and cold to the touch. He dreamt of a stair that went down under the crypt and a sound like ice learning a song. He dreamt of a woman's voice saying his name the way only one voice ever had, and he did not know if it was a memory or a wish or a warning. He woke with his own breath loud in his ears and the castle quiet around him and the cold finding new places to keep. Morning came clear and brittle. Men moved more carefully, as if the ground had grown ears. The dragons lifted yawning smoke. The dead waited. Waiting is also a kind of move. On the ramparts, Jon and Daenerys stood together and looked north. The sky had the color of a blade sharpened too far. The snow glittered in a way that meant nothing unless you had learned to read it. A powder will blow, a crust will hold. A drift will kill you if you think it is a hill and step as if stepping mattered. They did not speak. Somewhere in the distance a single horn sounded. Not alarm, not celebration, but the call men make to one another when they are about to pick up something heavy again. The dead were coming. The living stood. The door waited. The bells were quiet, because this was not their moment. The bread was eaten because that is what bread is for. The fire kept its shape. The snow decided on a direction. The day drew its breath and held it. They would hold. They would hold again. They would open the door when it had to be opened, and they would not bring fire where it would only make a hunger that did not know how to stop. They would pay in blood and find a way to make that price mean something other than a footnote. They would tell truths afterward and think them brave. They would lie afterward and think themselves kind. They would keep walking upstairs and down into crypts and out into fields and along walls and through doors, because that is what living people do when winter is trying to make them statues. And when night came back to collect more of what it believed belonged to it, they were where they had sworn themselves to be. Hand on stone, breath in air, eyes on dark, waiting as if waiting were a weapon.